Hi, I've been having a great deal of fun trying to learn how to work with glass. And one of the things I've been trying to do specifically, besides lamp working, making cabochons, is to use it in the dyes to press vintage designs using glass. So I was inspired by looking at the way they manufacture Czech glass buttons and the way some lamp workers use presses, to put textures on things like leaves and that kind of thing. What I found is that with some inspiration from other people too that have been doing this, there are a couple different ways to manage this feat. And so today what I've done is I put together an overview summary type of a video that will summarize, without going into any great detail, several of the techniques that I use to make these cabochons. And I've done these 4 today, and then I've used 3 slightly different techniques. In the first, I've used a classical lamp working technique using an oxygen propane torch, which frankly, it took me a while to get going, but I think that's the way I'll be going from now on mostly. But then there's another thing you can do with a single gas torch. I just think you have to work with smaller pieces and don't be so ambitious. But then there's a third technique I've been using, which can work really well for some things, and that's using a microwave kiln to press the glass. So I've got small examples of each of those 3 techniques. And before we get into how I made all 3 of these, or all 4 of these cabochons, I'm going to very briefly diverge to have a brief segment on how you might be able to set this up. If you've never done this before and you want to just try it, I think there's a way to do this for about $100 total right now. Just to see if you get something that you might want to continue with. Okay. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. And as always, apologies to people that actually know what they're doing and they do this. I just like to share the process that I use for these things and hopefully inspire others to explore their own journeys in creativity. Thanks. Diversion here. Before I go into the 3 ways of doing this in detail, I want to tell folks how I would advise or certainly suggest you try this for the first time. So you don't have to invest a lot of money, and because you can invest a lot of money if you want. So minimally, what I would do is get a good torch head, and this is a very nice torch head for a single gas torch. It's called the hot head, and it was designed, I think, specifically for beadworkers. It will work perfectly well. It's really a very, very nice torch, but I would advise always to stay small. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, small is easier because there's less mass of metal or less mass of glass, and this isn't going to get as hot as the gas and oxygen torch. Also, smaller cabochons are less likely to crack if you cool them slowly. And so that's a good thing to do. So what I would do, though, is invest in a hothead torch and a can of gas. These will run you about $40 right now. And that's the biggest expense when you're starting out for this kind of doing it. Then I think you want to get a couple of mandrels, and these are cabochon mandrels. They're stainless steel. I got these from Devardi Glass, but if you look online, there's several places you can get them. And again, if you're starting out, just get a couple. They're $5 or $6 a piece, and get something. This is a 1-incher. That's a 3/4 inch. Don't go above 1 inch. You can, but it'll be tough going with this torch. So I keep them small. And then you need some bead release. Again, you can go to Hobby Lobby and get some, or I got this off the internet. It's quite nice. And you'll use bead release on the surface of your mandrel in order to have the glass not stick to the very hot steel. Then I strongly suggest that you get just a random selection of like a pound of 104 glass rods, right? And so it'll be, I would use the 104 coefficient of expansion if you're going to use this torch. I've successfully used this torch with 90. But I think it's a lot easier with the 104, which has a lower melting temperature. Anyway, that will be the minimum that you need. Oh, you probably want miscellaneous. You want some vermiculite or something to plunge your hot thing into to let it cool down at least partially slowly. You're going to want to have some kind of fireproof surface. These are fire bricks. You could use metal if you want. And then, of course, some dyes. And I have a whole selection of absolutely gorgeous Potter dyes from Kevin Potter's shop. And again, there are just thousands of available designs that are these small, like less than an inch wide or long ring tops, and sort of flowers and essentially buttons and things like this that you could do for very little money to invest. Anyway, that's, before I start going into the details of the other stuff, that's what I would recommend that you think about if you have never done this before and you just want to have a chance to see if it's something that you might want to play with. Okay? Enjoy. Preparing the mandrels is pretty straightforward. What you need to do, if it's brand new, heat it up in the torch just to burn off any junk that's on it. And then I always clean it with a wire brush. I actually have a wire wheel on a grinder, and I simply polish them up or clean them up to start with. And then every single time I am going to replace the bead release, I run it through the wire brush again. Okay, so it seems to help a great deal to have a nice clean surface with a few scratches on it. Now, what I use is bead release that, I'm not going to recommend a particular kind, but I've had very good luck with this, and there's a couple of others that work just fine. I think they're all very similar. It's a mixture of like pulverized fired stuff. So I keep it in a plastic jug. It will separate almost immediately. So before you use it, you give it a good shake. Open it. It's just like mud. It'll smell like mud. Now I take the mandrel and I put it on the surface and I twist it, and then as I lift it, I twist it fast, and that kind of, by centrifugal force, throws bead release off the edge, and that looks like a fairly reasonable amount of bead release. This goes just in an upright container with sand, and I let it dry. Now you can fire them to dry them, but if you do, start really slow. Evaporate the water first, and then hit them with some heat. It seems to work a little better if you leave them overnight to dry naturally. So what I've done is set up 3 sort of independent stations for glasswork right now. I use my welding table for the oxygen and propane torch. That is probably what I'll be using most, because I only do welding on occasion, like as needed, and I can always do that on the same table. Anyway, that's that setup. And then the other setup, of course, is the single torch. This is a hothead torch, and it's what I started with, and I recommend it. It's useful for small things. It's not particularly useful for larger things. The glass I have currently, I've concentrated on 90 COE, which is this material here. I am laying in some borosilicate just to play with some borosilicate now that I have the oxygen torch. And then I have a significant amount of 104, which is pretty standard bead making glass, and it's pretty nice stuff. And it's what I would recommend that you use if you use this single gas torch head. And I'll show you how to work with that. Another thing that I will show you how to do is over here is to use a microwave. And what we'll do is we'll melt some glass in a microwave kiln, and then we'll press a die into that. And that's another option for you. This crock pot filled with vermiculite on a timer is what I use to garage pieces before I can anneal them. For these small pieces, as long as you let them cool down gradually, They probably won't crack on you, but anything above a quarter of an inch thick and an inch in diameter is likely to crack if you're not careful. So I leave this set on low to high. It stays a couple hundred degrees, and I simply put the mandrel with the glass in there to wait until I can harvest it the next day, and then save a whole bunch of them to anneal all at once. Okay, so we'll try this one first. What I'm going to do is use a lamp working approach that's been shown by a couple of other people. It works pretty well for putting glass into these steel dies that I normally would use to press metal. Now, for this particular torch, I will be wearing these didymium glasses. These cut the sodium flare, and you need these really for working with an oxygen torch. When you work with the hothead torch, the single gas torch, they're helpful and you should wear safety glasses, but the sodium flare isn't as bad because it doesn't get as hot. Anyway, so what we're going to do is on this torch, I'm going to do, as an example, one of my favorite larger dyes. This is the Poppy Queen, and I'll do her in a transparent dark blue. These are both 90 COE. And then I'll do the moon. This is a nice half moon or quarter crescent moon, and I'll use this real pretty light blue color. It's an opaque. So first thing we will do is hopefully the oxygen has been running long enough to have some. So I'll start the torch, add some oxygen, and that's about close to where you want it. Now, what I'm going to do for the Poppy Queen, normally I'd have these on my other side just so I didn't have to cross the torch with my hand, but I'm going to be careful here just for video. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a 1 1/4 mandrel that's been coated with bead release. That's just like a kiln wash type material. Now that will have to be heated up. It needs to be baked in, but it doesn't take as long as it does to warm up the glass. Okay, so then what I'll be doing is warming up this nice pretty blue glass. You don't want to thermally shock it too badly. Some glass, it'll pop on you no matter what, but you should just plan on being careful with it. So just kind of wave it around, let it get hot. When it's getting really hot and it isn't popping, it'll turn orange, begin to become molten. Now what I want to do is very simple. I'm just going to melt a glob of this glass, and I'm going to deposit it on this mandrel. I found that the key to getting a good pressing on these mandrels is to, right before you press it, make sure, either on this torch or the other torch, make sure that the glass is molten. It really doesn't work well if you rush that part of it. Okay, so now what we do is we keep the mandrel close to the flame, and we keep the glass in the flame. And we're just going to load glass on. And I'm going to do this real time so you can see. One of the things that I discovered, one of the reasons I really like this oxygen torch for doing this, and this is pretty simple. This is not like fancy lamp working. This is just melting glass. Is it matches my degree of patience. The hothead torch is perfectly fine. It does a great job. But frankly, I discovered that it just takes a little longer. And so I advise working with smaller pieces if you're going to use a single gas torch. And there are a bunch of reasons why working with smaller pieces is actually a pretty good idea for that. We'll go over that when the time comes. So you can see that this can go pretty quickly. All I'm doing is sort of loading on. This mandrel, this 1 1/4 mandrel, is just about the same size as the die. And for me, since I will finish my pieces as cabochons, in other words, I will cut them I don't worry too much about getting everything perfect off the lamp work. If you don't have the ability to do some sanding and some polishing of these things, then what you have to do is simply take a lot of time to match the amount of glass, and then to get it off, you just sort of curl it around and do that, and then put it over to the side where it's hot. Now see, it's just this yucky looking glob. Now what I want to do is leave this in the flame long enough that it is sort of uniformly molten. If you rush that, you will not, I guarantee you will not get a good pressing, and it'll have so much stress in it because of the different temperatures, and you're going to be rapidly cooling this anyway. We're always working on the edge of what you can do without thermally shocking the hell out of everything. Anyway, so we'll just let this become a molten puddle, carefully holding it over this steel table, not your lap, because as you can see, it's moving around. Okay, that's really good. So what I'm going to do now is simply move it over to the die, press it, see, rock a little bit, and lift. You can see what it looks like. And then I'm going to put it back in the flame, not in the hottest part, just a little bit, to flame polish it, bring it back up to temp. That looks pretty good. And then it's going over into the crock pot. Okay, so that was that one. That went into the crock pot, and that'll stay there for 8 hours or more, cooling down, and then it'll turn off, and I'll just wait until tomorrow morning before I pick it out, and then I'll deal with that then. So I'll probably take a couple of days to make this video so I can show you the final results. Okay, now we're going to do the moon. And again, you want to warm this glass. Opaque. I found opaque glasses tend to, well, for me at least, they tend to be a little more persnickety. They're easier to do in some ways because they're unlikely to bubble and crunch and pick up a lot of crap from the torch compared to transparents. But because of the heavy pigmentation in them, I think they pop a little more for me. So I'm just trying to be a little more careful with this. Now, again, I've sized the mandrel for the die. The die itself is only about 3/4 of an inch. So I'm using a 1-inch mandrel. And again, I tend to load much more glass on than you need to. And that's because I'm treating it like a rough stone, and I'm actually finishing my glass cabochons on my lapidary equipment. And that means that I use a slightly different approach than some other folks do. Because I kind of like them with a very highly finished appearance. Okay, now you see how quickly this can go. We're just going to get some glass on there. I want to make sure we get just enough. Finish our glass, put it where it's safe, and then we'll let that get molten. I see some air bubbles in there, and with a little good fortune, they will smoosh out. Now, that looks really good. So what I'm going to do is put it down here on top of the die, press it, release, lift it. It's looking probably pretty good. But again, what you want to do is fire polish the chill marks. And I like to bring it back up a few degrees in temperature because, if I get it red again, pushing it into the steel die is creating one heck of a thermal change for the glass. And as long as the die is cold, or room temperature to start with, nothing's going to stick on it. In fact, it's cold back now. But now this is going to be closer to an annealing temperature that I'll put back in this vermiculite. Okay, so I really love using this torch. And I'll probably be doing some more demonstrations with this as I go forward. There are many talented people doing YouTubes on lamp working, which I advise you to check out. But I'm just going to probably be doing a few simple things. But I'm emphasizing making die pressed glass, even though I'm working on trying to learn some lamp working techniques for myself. Okay, next step, we'll do the single gas torch. So now I turn the torch off. So to do that, again, oxygen off, and then propane off. And then in this case, the oxygen goes back on because I've got an oxygen generator or concentrator, and they don't like to push into pressure. So they have to have a constant flow, or they don't function well. So with the hothead torch, the single gas torch, I highly recommend that you use coefficient of expansion 104 glass, which is pretty standard lamp working glass, only because it has a lower melting point and will become liquid at a lower temperature. You can do 90 and 96 and even bottle glass with it, but I just began to get frustrated that way. So that's what I recommend. I also recommend staying small, no more than 1 inch and preferably a little less. So what I'll be doing is I'll be using this pretty grass green glass, and I'll press one of these two ring top cabochons. These are about 3/4 of an inch in the longest dimension. And so I'll be using the 1 inch mandrel. And so I'll show you how we go about doing that. So the first step, of course, will be to place the glass on this, and then it'll be to press into this. Okay, so that'll be pretty straightforward. I'll probably do 2 of them because I only have 1 camera, and I'll have to change viewpoints. Alrighty, so this will be a little loud, but I'm wearing my microphone, so hopefully you'll hear. But all I'm going to do is the same exact thing, which is warm the glass. Find the problem with these torches, not a problem, the thing you have to realize about them is they're going to be a more complicated and cleaner or dirtier flame than the gas and oxygen torch. So there will be a sweet spot. Let me start this up and show you what I mean. Okay, so you may be able to see this well, you may not be. The gas flame, clearly, let me get a mandrel. Right here is the candle. The candle is where the gas is emerging and igniting, and so it is the hottest just beyond the tip of that, right? Now the problem with these is that in this region and in right here, where it is the hottest, it's also quite dirty. It's very reduced. And what that means is that there's still some gas that has not completely combusted. Then way out here, where you begin to see the yellow, that's basically, things are just not completely, or they're completely goopy. This is where you would get the deposition of soot, for example. So with this flame, you only have a region right about here in which you can work. And that's what I find most difficult from my personal point of view, is keeping this sweet spot located, and that's the problem. So, well, we can do it. So what I'll do first is, of course, begin heating the mandrel. And what I might do is I might go ahead and try to do this with one shot. I might change the camera angle. And then I'm going to start again. Start heating the glass way out here. If I were being a perfectionist about this, I would be pulling off the little bit here on this end because it has a slight defect that might cause a bubble. But what I'm doing is I want to let that glass warm up. And of course, the difficulty is that at no time during any part of the process do you want to put your glass too far close to the candle. Okay, so that should be close to being okay for heating up. So what we're going to do is now try to gather some molten glass. This process takes just a little longer than it would with the oxygen. But notice it does perfectly well. And you can do absolutely phenomenal work with this hothead single gas torch. So I'm just going to get this to where I can begin putting it onto the mandrel. And now, just as before, I simply have to load molten glass onto the mandrel. And again, I think you will find this is a very enjoyable process if you stay small. I would stay 3/4 of an inch, no more than an inch. If you go try to do the bigger ones, I mean, I did, and I did some successfully, but man, those are lessons in frustration. Doing the larger ones, and you'll see why in a second. Because what will be the problem here? Not a problem. What is the reality is, it's going to take a little longer for me to be comfortable that the glass is molten and ready to press. So again, we'll capture our hot glass. And now, this is where I get impatient. And if you get impatient at this stage and turn up the flame, that's where you're very likely to get some soot or deposits of schmutz on the glass. It happens, and it happens no matter what I do sometimes, but I can guarantee it will happen if you turn the flame up. So what you do is just have to be patient. Keep the glass in that region. Notice it's still not uniformly molten. Until it's uniformly molten, I can almost promise you that you won't get a good pressing. It's very close to being okay though. So what I'll do is see if I can readjust the camera angle from where I am. I'm just going to take this out for a moment. Make sure that it's nice and hot. And we'll press it into this ring top. And again, I'm using more glass than I need. If you were uncomfortable polishing your cabochon, what you want to do is practice so that you can use just exactly the amount of glass that you want. Yes, that pressed nicely. So once again, I just simply run it back through the flame. We heat it back up a little bit, polish out the chill marks, and then right into the vermiculite. And there you have it. Okay, so the third thing that you can do, which is actually really fun, and it's applicable to a lot of different adaptations. It's commonly used more really to fuse the glass or to put it into molds, but I discovered that I can use it productively for this pressing. So what I do is I use a microwave kiln, and I recommend these smaller ones. They're just easier to deal with overall, but you only do one piece at a time, but that's okay. All this is refractory material, and then there's a lining, I think this is of silicon carbide, which absorbs microwaves. And so when you microwave this thing, this chamber, this is going to get hot as a pistol, and it's going to turn bright red, and it has a vent. Don't block that vent. It needs to have heat escape. And then whatever you put inside there is going to be exposed to the extremely high temperatures. Now, it's more than adequately high to melt glass, virtually any of the glasses. What I'm going to use for this one is just a couple of pieces of some Devardi glass. It's COE 90 I have, and I'll use this transparent blue. You do not want to put glass directly upon the refractory surface of the kiln because it'll ruin it. This is kind of lightweight material, and it'll get goobered up. So what you do is you use some kind of either kiln wash, which is like the bead release, or you can use these papers. This is like a ceramic paper. I like this heavier ceramic paper. It will put a texture on the back of your cabochon. But frankly, since I'm cutting them and polishing them anyway, I don't care. If that isn't to your liking, then you should buy some what's called kiln paper, which is this thinner material that's a paper that has a ceramic coating, and that will leave a much smoother surface for you. I don't use it that much because I don't need to. So all I did was cut a piece of that to fit the bottom of that sight, and then I'm going to carefully put my glass pieces on. You want to be sure that they're touching and that they're in the middle. Don't put too much on. Believe it or not, I mean, it's possible to put too much on and have it adhere to the kiln. That's not a good thing. And then we're going to carefully put this into the microwave. Okay, so what I'll do then is put this in the microwave. Now in the microwave, you've got your old tray, and this is a very, very old microwave. Don't use a good microwave for this. This one is many, many years old. Of course, you don't want the bottom of the kiln touching this glass surface, because this will get hot enough that it might crack even this nice resistant glass. So keep it elevated on some ceramic bits. So I'm going to put this back in, and then I'm just going to carefully move the kiln with the glass into the microwave. I like to put it in without covering it, because inevitably, the glass moves on you, and you're going to have to reposition it before you put the lid on. Okay, that looks really nice. Now I'll just put the lid on it, close the microwave, and I'm going to, this is where you'll have to calibrate your microwave. Every one of them is going to be different. This one I'm going to go for 6.5 minutes and leave it on high for 6.5 minutes and come back and show you what that molten glass looks like. Okay, it's within 45 seconds or so of at least me checking it. If it isn't completely molten, you can put it back in, but if you get your microwave dialed in, it should be fine. Now you're going to have to use extremely heavy heat-proof gloves. Don't just try to use a hot pad or like oven mitts. That just will not be sufficient. So be sure that you do some research online and get yourself some very nice gloves that allow you to handle extremely hot material. Put it on a fireproof surface and nothing else. Have your die ready to go. It's at room temperature again. We're going to try this flour here, and I'll show you how this process works. It's incredibly easy, but there are just a couple of fiddly bits you have to worry about. Okay, let's see if this worked. So what I'll do is I'll pull this out. It's looking promising, because you'll notice that in the vent you can see that bright orange. That means clearly that there's a lot of heat in there. Now what I'm going to do is open this up with one hand. I'll be using my other hand to press this down onto the molten glass, and then it's a matter of guessing. And I'll tell you why as we do this. So let's take a look and see what this looks like. So we look at this up. That's a nice pool of molten glass. Look how hot that is. That's too hot to put it right back on top. If you pressed it and put this right back on top, it would simply melt away all of your pressing. So what you have to do for these is this. You lift it up, you take your die and press it into the glass. Now leave it there for like the count of 5 to 10 seconds, and then lift it off. There you have your impression. Now, in order to avoid heat shock too much, again, instead of fire polishing it, just carefully leave this lid back on, but not for a long time. Just let it heat a little bit, and then if you need to, I often blow on this lid. I like it to be about 1/3 red, orange. And I've discovered that in my hands, when I use my thermometer, my high temp thermometer for the kiln, that will stay about 950 to 1,000. As long as it's below like 1,100 degrees, you're not going to re-melt the glass. And that's what you want to avoid. You want to avoid both re-melting the glass, but you also want to avoid letting the glass become too cool too quickly. So now what I'm going to do is leave this sit for an hour or two at least, and that'll cool it naturally. Now, that will be good enough in most cases that the piece won't crack on you, at least not immediately. But after that, we'll have to anneal this separately. So I don't take pieces like this and put them into the crock pot as a garaging. I just use the body of this kiln to do that for me. Because that's not going to be a very good annealing anyway, but that should allow that piece to cool reasonably well. Anyway, that once again, if you don't have the ability or the desire to use sandpaper, wet dry sandpaper, or something to finish and cut these down to size, then you have to be much more careful about the amount of glass you use. But man, I tell you, even if you have a very simple glass grinder or wet dry sandpaper or some way to manipulate the pressings after you've done them, it makes the pressing part much more enjoyable and fast, because then you're not that worried about getting all the edges just perfect, because you're going to be treating it like a stone cabochon, which is kind of nice. So now this is very hot, so I'm taking my gloves off, but then I'm not going to be touching it. Again, I leave my microwave open for just a few minutes, and then you can close it. It's hot. This will be hot now. This is a little too hot to touch or hold for any length of time, because compared to the lamp working approach, this is in much more direct contact for a little longer with the molten glass than it was in that other approach. So we'll see how that works. So these are the pieces that we just did. This is the nice transparent blue one. This is the Poppy Queen that we did with the oxygen torch. And you see it has a rim of glass around it. That's the excess. It also has bead release on the back. What happens when you put these mandrels with the cabochons into the vermiculite in the hot crock pot, it will cool down to a point where the bead release no longer adheres to the steel mandrel, and they just drop off. And so typically, after about an hour, I just pull the mandrels out so I can prepare them for the next ones, and just leave the pieces in the vermiculite until I can go grab them the next day. This is the Blue Moon that we did. That looks very nice. And here's the small ring top that we did, that we used the hot head torch for, the single torch. And then this is the one that came out of the microwave kiln, that nice flower. And you'll notice in all cases, I tend to overuse glass because I'm equipped to deal with these as cabochons, and I can easily cut or trim off the excess. If you're going to be sort of sanding these by hand or using a Dremel to do it, you're going to want to probably, with practice, simply get a little more conservative with the amount of glass you use, so that you don't have these large ridges around or edges. Okay, so next step for me will be to cut these, trim them, and then I'll use the lapidary wheels to just give them a little bit of a polish to see how they're going to do. Sometimes they won't survive that, but 95% of the time they do, and then it'll be after that I decide to anneal them. These next steps are something that not everyone is going to be set up to do, but you can figure out alternatives. And again, the way to avoid it is to just be very, very conservative with the glass you're using, the amount of glass, so that you don't have to do too much in the way of preparation. Now, that said, I actually think that the extra labor, the way I'm doing it, gives a very, very finished look. I think very professional finished look to the cabochons. So the first thing I want to do is, I don't always use the diamond bandsaw, but when you have this much glass, it just makes sense to lop off some before you put it on the grinding wheels. If there's less of a ridge, sometimes with something like this, I'll just use the grinding wheel on this. So if you have a glass grinder or a Dremel tool with a diamond bit and some water, you can carefully trim these, but always use water when you're working with glass or other silicates. Okay, so this is going to be a little loud, but I'm going to turn on my water to the saw, and then there. And so, that's you could be more accurate with this, but I don't need to be, because I'm going to grind it to a round profile. I also have a trim saw with what I use for rock that works pretty well. I like this thing because I do opal, and sometimes it's really nice to be able to very cleanly with water cut the opal rough. Anyway, it works nicely for something like this. So what I'll do is trim the other pieces, and then use the diamond grinders on the lapidary to polish up the edges and the backs a little bit. Well, I'll just briefly run through what I do for each cabochon. I'll just show one, and I probably will fast forward through some of this, but then I'll do the rest of them as well, but I won't put that all on tape. So here's the Blue Moon. It's been trimmed, and it still has the bead release. So what I'm going to do first is just grind the edge to give it a profile. Then I'll move to the sintered wheel, and I'll take off the back to get rid of the bead release and polish the edges. And I'm going to cut these so that I have a 10-degree bevel on the edges, and what that will do is allow me to set them in a bezel if you want. And then I'll just run through and polish them all until they look nice without scratches. Okay, so turn on the water. This is also the way I will control for the thickness. It's not easy to get an evenly thick piece when you press the molten glass, so I almost always have to flatten it somewhat by identifying where it's a little thicker and cutting that a little bit more thin on this wheel. So you can let them slam into the metal, and if they're going to break, they're going to break here. That's starting to look okay, but use a little more. But I'll still anneal them. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now I also will go ahead and take this sharp edge off, because sharp edges and glass, not only are they dangerous, but that's also making them prone to cracking. You're better off easing all of the edges. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. Yeah. And there we have it. That's the essentially finished cabochon. It still needs to be annealed, and if I was going to put luster on it, I would do that too. I mean, these look really pretty with the stars picked out in a slightly different contrasting color. But yeah, that's all there is to it, really, making cabochons. Now, the one reason that I show you this is because the finished product actually takes a little bit more effort than simply pressing the glass into a die. To make it look really, really nice, you either have to be very cautious starting out and all through the process, or you have to have the ability to treat them like stone cabochons. Well, our next step is going to be to anneal the glass, and I save up a couple pieces to do at once because it's more efficient. The ones that we just did for the demo are this flower in the microwave, the poppy queen, and a blue moon in the lamp work with the oxygen torch, and then this beautiful grass green ring top using the hothead torch. Okay, so so this is an example of an intaglio. You don't have the technique worked out just yet, but it actually will look pretty nice, I think, when it's done. I may polish some of these again, even after they've been annealed a little bit more. I like to wait and see. Now, why anneal? Well, every time you heat or cool something like glass or plastic, there will be internal stresses formed because of uneven cooling or expansion and contraction during the process. So, especially in these pieces, even though they're small, by definition, when we press them, we're creating regions of depth and thickness immediately adjacent to very thin regions. So that's asking for trouble in terms of cracking in the glass later on. So these are actually pretty tough. You saw that, but I like to be sure, so we're going to anneal in the kiln. Now, a quick and dirty way to reveal stresses in the glass would be to take polarized filters. This is basically a vintage polariscope from Bausch and Lomb, but these are lined up so that each of these polarized filters, when they're like this, they're perfectly cross-polarized so that you let almost no light through. So what happens is if you sandwich a piece of something, transparent something in between them, and you look at it, you can see wherever there are stressors or internal stress, that material will then shift the polarity of some of the light so that it actually gets through, and it creates all sorts of patterns. So let's take a look. This is plastic, and we'll take a look at our poppy queen before annealing and see how this annealing process. So if we take a look at our plastic again against a bright light, you can see that there's a great deal of stress in that injection molded, and especially where you see sharp points or sharp lines, like where that little spot is right there. That's where it's going to crack, if it's going to crack at all. So let's take a look at what the poppy queen looks like. And again, the poppy queen, it is not bad because I let it cool very slowly, and it's actually kind of small. But it turns out, you can see that Maltese cross. That's what I found out is a sort of classical lens-like example where the internal stresses are creating some degree of cross-polarized patterning here. So this is, because that's not sharp, right? There are very few sharp edges there. it's not incredibly stressed, but annealing should get rid of even that and allow the pattern to completely smooth out. So that's what we're going to aim for. Annealing is a topic all of itself that you should probably look into if you're going to be doing this. There are literally hundreds of references and YouTubes for it. At the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to heat this glass up to a temperature that is well below the liquefaction or melting point, but it's going to be high enough that all the molecules get sort of intermixed. They lose much of their rigidity and they can move around a little bit in that quasi-crystal. And that's for these soft glass things, that's going to be between like 850 and 950 Fahrenheit. And, there are very, very specific schedules for these things if you were going to get into this. But I'm just going to do that. I'm going to raise the temperature very slowly to about 950 degrees. And then I'm going to hold it there for about half hour, 45 minutes, because everything in here is much less than a quarter of an inch thick. And then I'm going to turn down my rheostat, my little control module, to what I know is about 800, and let it cool for another 45 minutes to an hour to 800. Now, what that means is that'll be about the strain temperature, which is below that. It probably won't be affected by the change in temperature. So you want to warm it slowly to the annealing temperature, soak it in the annealing temperature for a period of time, cool it very slowly to the strain temperature, and then I'll just turn off the kiln and let it cool for over like 4 or 5 hours to room temp, okay? Now, someday I will purchase probably a big boy kiln to do this and program it. But what I have available is a really nice little kiln. This is something that my wife and stepson got me for a Christmas present years ago. And it's actually really handy for enameling and doing small pieces. But of course, it's all manual, and they don't sell this model anymore. But you can get similar things. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I just put the cap on, and then I have a temperature probe that will work with high temp, that I will insert a probe in there, turn it on, and then I have this rheostat type thing over here that I've pre-calibrated to be approximate temperatures. So what I'm going to do is turn it on with it set to aim for about 950. And then I'm going to set my timer on my watch for 45 minutes. And we'll make sure in between that the temperature goes to about 950, and then we'll hold it there for another 45 minutes or so. Well, it's been about 6 hours. The kiln came back down to room temperature, which up here in the studio right now is about 80 degrees. And so we'll see what we have. Well, nothing cracked tremendously. Have some dust that came off the refractory material. Everything's looking like it didn't explode. That's a good thing. So let's check out our Pompey made in that beautiful transparent cobalt blue and see if we've eliminated the Maltese cross that indicated that there was some internal stress. Even though it was distributed reasonably well, we wanted to get rid of that. And then I'll check these others too. Okay, so as a reminder, what I'm going to do is simply place the piece between two polarized filters, and they're organized so that they are at exactly cross, and oh my, yes, that's beautiful. Yep, we did it. So basically there's just a little hint of stress in there, you can see, but generally that is really nice. Okay, so yeah, that's a pretty darn good annealing cycle. I'm gonna go grab one of the other ones, transparent ones, and just see, make sure that they all did okay. Let's see, let's pick this light green lotus, because it's real pretty. It's very transparent, so that Yep, that's completely done. So that's about as good of an annealing as I'm going to get, I think, doing it manually this way. And I'm comfortable with it. because even before the annealing, these things were pretty stable in the sense that I could whack them up against the concrete or the steel tray on my lapidary wheels, and they wouldn't break. So that's really quite pretty, isn't it? Huh, I like this.